Richard Foster from Foster Infrastructure here with the third in my series of videos on PPPs and pandemics. In the previous two videos, I looked at the contractual clauses that might be activated in a PPP contract as a result of a pandemic, and then I looked at negotiating outside of the contract to deal with the possible impacts of a pandemic, particularly where a government wants to change the nature of the infrastructure or the services being provided under the PPP contract. A few days ago, I was very interested to see some new guidance released by the Infrastructure and Projects Authority at HM Treasury in the UK. And this guidance is guidance on supporting vital service provision in Private Finance Initiative and Private Finance 2 contracts during the COVID-19 emergency. In the UK, Private Finance Initiative and Private Finance 2 contracts are largely government pays PPP contracts. So what does this guidance say about PPPs and pandemics? Well, after reading through the background introductory paragraphs, I came to paragraph 3 and I found it said something very interesting. It says that, as a matter of contract, government does not regard COVID-19 as an event of force majeure. Now that is bizarre. It's bizarre in the sense that the government is purporting in a guideline to say what the contractual position is under hundreds of different PPP contracts in the United Kingdom. In the UK, the common law applies, and they take the approach that is common in common law countries of having an exhaustive list of force majeure events defined in the contract. Now, it is not for government to say through a guideline whether or not a pandemic is a force majeure event in contracts. It is up to the actual wording in the individual contracts as to whether the pandemic is a force majeure event. Now, I took a look at the standard contract wording that was recommended in the UK for both Private Finance Initiative and PF2 contracts. And in that suggested wording, it is very clear that a pandemic is not one of the listed events of force majeure. So as a factual matter, it is likely that in almost all, if not all, of the contracts to which this guidance note is referring, a pandemic is not one of the defined events of force majeure. That doesn't detract, though, from the fact that it is throwing hundreds of years of UK legal tradition and the whole contractual framework in the UK out the window if we just say through a guidance note the government has decided that a pandemic is not a force majeure. We must look at the actual contracts. So having read that paragraph, I was just about ready to take this guidance note and tear it up and throw it out the window, but I'm glad I didn't. I actually read on, and when I read on, I found some really good advice on how to deal with the broader impact of the pandemic on PPP contracts. In my previous video, I talked about the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre, seen in this photo behind me, and the possibility of government negotiating with the private sector to temporarily use that facility as a hospital and a morgue in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The UK's new guideline discusses the broader issue of how do we deal with the fact that in many PPP contracts it will simply be difficult for the private sector to fully comply with the contract while all of the government restrictions and the other impacts of the pandemic are ongoing. So the guideline says that contracting authorities have to recognise that their contractors may be unable to fully perform their contracts during this period. Now, the default contractual position, if a contractor cannot perform as a result of the pandemic, and the pandemic is not a force majeure event and it doesn't otherwise give the contractor some contractual right to relief or compensation, the default position is that it is their risk. If they can't perform, then they suffer the contractual consequences, which in a government pays PPP typically is a reduction in their payments. However, the new UK guidance suggests a different approach to this default risk position. It says that in these circumstances, contracting authorities should, through agreement with their partners, moderate the contractual requirements and moderate the standards and the payment and performance mechanisms. It goes on to state that the normal unitary charge payments to the contractors should continue to be made. Unitary charges, they are the government payments made under the PPP contract. So in effect, it's saying even though the private sector may be unable to fully perform as required by the contract, they should still be entitled to their payments as if they had performed. Now, why would a government decide that this is a sensible position? Well, the reality is the pandemic is something so far outside the contemplation of the parties, and it is something that, in some circumstances, private sector parties to PPPs will genuinely have no control over. But we don't want this short-term difficulty we're going through to result in PPP contracts falling over because our private sector partners cannot perform, they fall into default, and we decide to terminate the contracts. That in effect would mean if a contract had another 10 years to run, it had been a successful PPP, then we would be letting this pandemic bring what was a worthwhile value for money arrangement for government to an end at a time when we are dealing with a lot of other difficulties. It's actually far better in this situation that we try and stabilise things, we try and continue working as best we can until at some point, maybe in 6 months, maybe in 12 months, maybe in 18 months, we can revert to business as normal. This sounds like quite a generous position for the private sector. Effectively, the government is saying, even though you cannot do what's required by the contract, we will pay you as if you have done that. In my previous video, I talked about negotiating with a focus on the interests of each party. And as we look a bit further into this guidance from the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, we see that they are in fact taking some further steps to ensure that what is agreed to deal with the pandemic is actually something that focuses on the interests of both parties. In particular, if the private partner's recent performance has been poor, and as a result in previous months or previous quarters, their payments have been reduced for poor performance, then the pandemic shouldn't be effectively a get out of jail free card for them. They shouldn't suddenly get full payments if in fact their track record suggests that if it was business as usual, they would not be receiving full payments. The guidance recognises this, and it suggests taking the previous 3 months' payments as a baseline. So if a particular PPP contractor has been performing poorly and in the last 3 months they've only received 95% of the possible payment, then under the suggested negotiated arrangement to deal with the pandemic situation, government's position would be, well, we will keep paying you 95% of the payments. Now, if you're on the private sector side, that actually might seem a little harsh because you might argue our performance was poor in the previous 3 months, but we have recognised that, we've put in place strategies to address that, and we believe in the next 3 months we would have performed perfectly. Well, that may be the case, but the reality is, in a situation like this, there are going to be small gains and losses for each party, no matter what you agree. No solution is going to be perfect, but this sort of solution where you look at the previous 3 months' performance and then say, we will use that as a baseline, that is a very reasonable approach to take in my mind. There are a number of other recommendations in this guideline. You're welcome to go and read it yourself if you wish. I'll put a link in the video description. But I think the key message here is that this is a very pragmatic approach to dealing with the COVID-19 epidemic and its impact on PPP projects. It is essentially recommending that government contract managers and the private sector focus on the longer-term sustainability of the PPP and put in place appropriate temporary arrangements to ensure that we are not, as a result of this very unexpected and very significant event, we are not putting at risk the remaining term of the PPP contract where we might derive a lot of value once the pandemic is over. There is one other recommendation in the guideline that I think is particularly important, and I'm very pleased they included it. I mentioned in both my previous videos that in a crisis situation, always the paramount consideration should be human life and safety. This guideline includes a very clear statement that under no circumstances are performance requirements or contractual provisions to be relaxed to the point that health and safety are put at risk. So I think we're very much in agreement on that point. The approach to dealing with the impact of the pandemic on PPP contracts suggested in this guideline is not the only possible approach you could take, and some PPP contracts in their particular circumstances may require different solutions. But I think this is a very good piece of basic guidance that would be applicable to a wide range of PPP projects. And no matter what country you're in, if you are dealing with the impact of the pandemic on PPPs, this is a good reference point for you as to one particular approach that makes very good sense. Thank you very much for watching, and stay safe, everyone.